My co-presenters and I are super excited to be sharing the next hour and a half with you in a discussion of comics and world history from a multitude of perspectives. We would like to first take a quick moment and thank the WHA for making the Under the Baobab series a reality this summer, this year, a real point of light in an otherwise very weighty year. Two, as Secretary of the World History Association, I would be very remiss if I did not remind you that the 2021 call for papers for the WHA conference is live now. It will be a virtual conference, and we will not only be tackling the overall theme of health globally, but a variety of other themes and topics related to the study of world history. So please do consider submitting a paper, panel, or other proposal to the conference committee. While we have all hopefully had a chance to build our own and look through everyone else's digital business cards, I would like to do a very brief set of introductions for tonight's presenters, largely in the order that they will speak. First up is Alonso Nunez, Executive Director and Lead Instructor with Little Fish Comic Book Studio in San Diego. He's an avid advocate, hard to say twice, for comic mediums, and brings much more about the art and illustration side of the medium to our discussion tonight. Two, I would like to point out that we have just officially heard he is on the Eisner Awards Committee. Lawrence Abrams is a PhD candidate at UC Davis and is a devoted WHA member. His work on British imperial and world history dovetails neatly with his deep knowledge on a variety of popular culture mediums, which he brings into both his research and his teaching. Pamela Jackson holds the amazing title of Popular Culture Librarian and Comic Arts Curator for the San Diego University Library. She is, as we have also just recently learned, another member of the Eisner Awards Committee. Beth Pollard, who many of you already know, is the Distinguished Professor of Teaching Excellence at San Diego State University. A devoted world historian, Beth brings the all too often underappreciated angle of the ancient world into focus for us tonight. Ahem, achy world. Beth is also the creator of tonight's digital business card slide deck. She noted when telling us about it in the first place that it's a really wonderful way to do first day icebreakers, especially in the remote and virtual learning environments most of us are finding ourselves in. So something to keep in mind. Caleb Napa is also our PhD candidate from UC Davis, whose main research focuses on French history. Caleb's comics knowledge spans the breadth of modern sequential art history, bringing early French comics into conversation with modern superheroes. And then there's myself, the lone East Coast voice tonight. I'm Marianne Rett, Professor of History at Monmouth University, and I am very dedicated to the pursuit of weaving comics into all of my classes and research. And so like you, I am very excited to hear from my co-presenters tonight and eager to take back all their wisdom with me as I contemplate what 2021's spring semester is going to look like. Each of us are going to present for just about 5 minutes, and then we will move into breakout rooms where we will get to play with some example comics offered up by all of the presenters. After that discussion, we will reconvene back here for a larger group discussion before we conclude tonight's festivities. And with that, Alonso is going to start us off, and Pam is going to show the slides.
All right, great. Thank you for that, Mary. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. We will break you in gently by having the comic book guy go first. So, so I want to give you guys a little bit of a background of the visual components of comics. So early, we're talking the late 19th century, tended to split the visual and the written word. You would have a band of text usually at the bottom, very similar to how you would have a children's book now. But very quickly in America, this shifted and text was integrated into each panel or box of a comic, and communicated the story, dialogue, sound effects at the same time, which is all very intuitive for us as American readers. It was not so for early Italian readers who often referred to American comics as fumetti. Fumetti in Italian meaning a little smoke, because that's how they interpreted the word balloons or thought bubbles that you find in American comics. They thought it was quite funny at first. This is 1930s, 1940s, but since then have adopted this very universal, very intuitive way of communicating text and visuals at the same time, so that to this day, all Italian comics are called fumetti, not just American comics. So if we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So I wanted to just kind of talk a little bit about what is obvious and kind of break it open a little bit as we move forward. So this is, first of all, a panel from an Amazing Spider-Man annual featuring the first appearance of Speedball, just a random superhero character that I am enamored with, despite his kind of inherent silliness. Play bounces around. So, in comics, there is constant shift from panel to panel and page to page on the relationship between the visual and the written word. And that is very important to remember, right? Sometimes the story is carrying a panel and sometimes the visual is carrying a panel. But what is important is that there is a conscious decision and decision-making process on the part of the creator to address that and to use that in order to effectively communicate the story, right? And the use of this, right, the use of the relationship and that balance is dependent, of course, on the subject and, of course, on the style of the story that we're talking about in terms of genre, and then also the style of the artist and writer, or the artist and writer team, depending on their strengths or needs of the project. Next slide, please. So I wanted to bring in a page that I feel like is kind of perfunctory in its use of the kind of integration of word and image. So this is from a memoir, a graphic novel called I Remember Beirut by Zaina Abariched. It's from 2014, and it's a fine graphic novel, but it is fairly perfunctory, right? I don't like to use bad example, but rather because the written component of this is very moving, very heartfelt. This, you'll see that in essence, the visual is supplementing the written word rather than having a duet of sort, the two, where they kind of bounce off and mingle almost like pieces of a band, right? Where the relationship is shifting constantly. And so moving on, I chose this next selection as a strong example because it is right next door to Abariched in terms of style. That is on purpose. This is the art is by David Bay. He is a French cartoonist and was a point of inspiration for her early on in her career. This page is from a work called Best of Enemies, A History of US and Mid-East Relations. This is from the third book, the third and final book in that series, at least for now. And this, you can see that there's actually a more driving kind of relationship between the two, the written and the visual, right? So in essence, you have two tracks, the visual and the written. Sometimes they intersect, sometimes they don't. For example, in that last panel, I don't know if you can quite read it, but it's talking about it's talking about Al Qaeda, and it says that the U.S. Refrained from any ground intervention, and we can see that that information is incomplete without having the visual. Right? It tells us that there was an intervention, and we might infer that this was a drone strike, right, based on the time period. But seeing as we do these kind of beams of attack from the air. In essence, what the written word has done here is started the sentence, and then the finished sentence is completed by the visual, right? So the visual is picking up where the written word has dropped it off. And this is something to really consider in graphic history in terms of strong work and fully taking advantage of the comic book medium, right? Looking for that dance, if you will, between the visual and the written word. And with that, I will pass the mic, as it were, over to Lawrence, I believe.
All right, thank you, Alonso. So as Alonso just pointed out, that comics provide a very useful sort of visual medium for teaching, for reading. I'm going to focus on my, if we could just move to the next slide right away, I'm going to focus in my talk on what are some of the pitfalls and common issues that can arise. Now, it might seem a lovely idea just to sort of say, we're going to use comics in our classroom. We're going to teach presumably history, presumably world history, since that's what we're all here to talk about. And the goal is hopefully student skill development and increased comprehension of historical materials, and maybe some fun along the way. If we could take the next slide, please. Now, unfortunately, comics are not all created equal. And that's not a positive or a negative statement, but they are all very different. They come in a series of different kinds of internal sub-media. And you want to consider this when you're approaching the use of comics in your classroom for the first time. I know we have some veterans here in the rooms, but graphic histories, graphic memoirs are much more self-conscious sources. They're prepackaged with historical tools frequently. Not all of the shorter forms of comic content are going to behave the same way. That being said, they do have their own advantages. Classic comic strips and cartoon strips, short form comics like Japanese 4-frame manga, or even just your average superhero single issue comic, they're very small. They're discrete units. They're actually quite accessible, and that's something that can be quite useful in its own right. Now, that being said, comics do come with their own language, do come with their own sort of necessary learning curve. If we could advance to the next slide. Now, that learning curve in a classroom can be quite steep if you're not careful. Longer form comics, in particular, graphic novels, even serial issue comics, they come with a sort of preconceived set of issues that are in some ways comparable to asking students to make an analysis of a movie, of a TV show, of a piece of music, of a primary source picture. There are some crossover elements, but they're not always the same. In particular, the mixing of text and visual, as Alonso just commented on, can be very useful, but it also can be sometimes difficult to understand for students who've maybe never read a comic before. Every student comes in with a history of access to other kinds of media, whether it's music or movies, but not all students come in with comics knowledge. To that end, how much time you want to spend on easing that learning curve for the medium will depend to a certain extent on what you want your assessment outcomes to be. If you want your students to really analyze for content, it can be helpful, but not always necessary to spend a great deal of time teaching the comic methodology itself. If you want them to come away learning how to use comics, especially in the long term, or use a comics-based project, you're going to need to actually spend some time on that. If we can move to the next slide, please. To that end, I will say, however, that I find it quite helpful to, for a first encounter with a comic, send the students in blind. You get a much clearer assessment of what the students know in advance before you fill their heads with all the comics lingo. And it's very helpful for an initial assessment. Now, there are a lot of useful resources out there, but if many of you are coming across comic studies for the first time or teaching with comics for the first time, you're almost certainly going to run across Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. And you're going to hear a little bit more about that later in our talks today, I know. I'm going to say right up front, I'm not actually a fan of McCloud. But it's for a very specific reason. McCloud's work is excellent, and it does convey everything the students will need to know. However, it is done itself in a comic style, and not every student learns that material the same way. I find a very useful alternative to be Dave Gibbons and Tim Pilcher's How Comics Work, and I promise that's not just because my favorite superhero is on the front. So if we can move to the next slide. Ultimately, you will have to decide for yourself how much is too much material, how much you want to integrate or not. But basic points of advice I can give you. No comic, just like any other source, exists in a vacuum. You will never be able to just present material from comics and get away with it and hope your students will learn history. I've seen these mistakes made. They are not pretty when you get to the paper writing phase of your course. Secondly, always, if you can, and you won't always be able to, always, if you can, bear in mind that some comics have advertisements, have internal reception and feedback like editors' letters, and those are very valuable contextual sources. If we could move to the last slide, please. And finally, when you're designing your course, right up front, you have to say to your students that this is not a gut course. It's not a gimme course. Many of them will come in with that expectation pre-baked because it's comic books. It helps to state upfront and disabuse them of that notion. The other two final considerations are length of course and the area of focus. For world history, we have a lot of options, but if you want to use comics in a more area studied way, you are going to have to recognize right up front that you're not always going to be able to find a comic from an area or a particular period of history. Notably, this Macbeth the Red King I have here, it's the only comic on medieval Scotland. Length, of course, also comes into play. You're not going to have time to teach them comics language and comics methodology if you're, say, teaching a 6-week summer course. That being said, there are tools available, and I'll pass it over to Pam now because she's got a great package of topics on that front.
Great. So you don't need to be an expert in comics to teach using a comic, and I'm going to show you some resources to access ready-made curricula for the comic arts. So starting off with the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, they offer both discussion guides and using graphic novel guides, which are extremely robust. Most of the guides follow a formula, so I've done screenshots to show you some examples of what they look like. They include overviews to help place the comic in context, plot summaries. They'll give you descriptions of the key characters. Each guide includes general discussion questions and also specific discussion questions for a variety of subject areas, so instructors can hone in on what makes the most sense for their classes, for what subjects they're teaching. The guide also pairs suggested readings, so you might find prose, poetry, sometimes film and TV shows that can go with that comic. And then this will hopefully make K-12 teachers very happy. A lot of these guides match the comics to which Common Core standards they fit. Another resource is the Pop Culture Classroom. They create guides and also host guides that are created by the publishers themselves. So for example, the publisher created a teaching guide for the comic Kent State for Dead in Ohio. As you search for comics curricula online, you might notice a trend that's really nice for historians, that comics that explore historical topics seem to be more likely to have a teaching guide created for them. Many of these teaching guides include similar types of information to what I showed you from the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. So here are some excerpts from the Kent State Guide, which goes into a lot of the key themes that are used in the book. And then you can see that the discussion topics include both questions that are focused on history and then also questions that are focused on comics as a medium. There's going to be ideas for student projects. And while a lot of the ideas for student projects are sometimes geared towards the K-12 level, I think they can be used in higher ed. So you can take a look at those and see what can apply. And these guides as well also link to the Common Core standards. Another organization is Reading with Pictures. They offer support for specific titles, but they also include general teaching units on how to use comics in the classroom, generally speaking. And then next up, we have the OER project, which hosts the World History Project. They recently added a number of graphic biographies in the course to help humanize historical topics by telling a graphic story about a person in one page. I found the easiest way to find those, little librarian tip, is use graphic biography in the search box. That seemed to bring them back. Dr. Trevor Getz from San Francisco State University created this video that demonstrates how you might use those graphic biography pages in teaching and learning. I think this video is fantastic because it's not just about the historical content, but also how the comic book medium itself and the artistic choices help propel the story and the historical themes forward. Their video will talk about what's in the gutters, how the panels move from panel to panel, and looking at those sorts of things. And then, okay, and then, sorry, Scholastic offers one big guide now on using comics and graphic novels in the classroom. It is geared more towards K-12, but there's pieces that I think would also be useful for higher ed. And then lastly, it doesn't hurt to search the internet for examples. Just Google it and see what's out there. Look at the individual publisher's website for what they've put together. One example is Top Shelf Productions is usually pretty good about creating guides for teaching that are about when the comic is about a historical topic. They want us to use these in higher ed or in education in general, so they are helpful in creating these guides. So the final takeaways: you don't need to be a comics expert to teach with comics. Look for support online and look to your community of fellow professionals. We're all struggling with this sometimes, so we are here to share that, our ideas for how to teach. Look for ready-made curricula for inspiration. Even if there's not a guide that's created for a comic you want to use, similar types of books may spark your imagination. The discussion questions, the assignments that they give would apply to a different comic. And then, to quote the legendary cartoonist Trina Robbins, librarians are our friend. I hear her little voice saying that to me every time I run into her. It's become increasingly common for libraries to support comics research and for a librarian to have subject expertise in comics. And I know not every university has a position equivalent to mine, but check with your library's special collections department, or start with your history or English literature librarians would probably be the best place to see what kind of support they can offer. Now I'll turn it over to Beth.
Thanks, Pam. So after those presentations, it's my role to talk about how do we operationalize some of these ideas in a 16-week course. So next slide. I want to begin by emphasizing, there we go. So I want to begin by emphasizing how important for my approach to teaching comics through time is the development of a shared formal vocabulary. I have my students in comics and history at San Diego State for 16 weeks, so for a 16-week semester. So we can take several weeks at the beginning of the course to build that vocabulary together. And there are a number of ways to do that. I've provided links here on this slide. And yes, Angela, you all will have access to these slides and can follow these links to your heart's delight. And I aim to convince you that the return on that investment of time building vocabulary can be great. Next slide. For example, that shared vocabulary empowers students and you as the faculty person to make new observation on very old comics. I use that term in air quotes there, like using motion lines, figures, elapsed time, graphic weight to interpret the Chauvet cave paintings, or debating artistic choices with respect to frame, word image combinations like Alonso was talking about, bleed, and graphic weight to analyze Mena's 14th century BCE Egyptian tomb. Next slide, Pam. Students in my History 157 complete increasingly complex annotation assignments that offered scaffold practice in analyzing visual sources, moving up Bloom's admittedly disputed but still useful taxonomy. In a first assignment, students identify the graphic elements. They just point to them. In a later assignment, students identify and then explain the graphic elements and then try to assert an argument. And then in yet another later assignment, students compare and contrast how a theme is portrayed graphically in different sources over time. Okay, next slide. And once learners get confident in applying that kind of shared vocabulary, they're even more prepared to think about conundra spurred by investigating comics as sources for and about world history. And one of my favorite comics as source conundra is Working in the Gutters. The gutter, as Pam already mentioned, is that space in between panels where the reader does the work of filling in the story. Such work makes the consumer of the source complicit in and even essential to the storytelling. So 4 pages from Eric Schanauer's Age of Bronze Sacrifice, I'm the ancient person, I have to do this, a graphic telling of the Trojan War, illustrate this complicity of the reader. So I've got 4 pages here for you. So on the first and second page, you see all of these Greeks standing around. And so even with that, and even on the third page, you see the raised blade there in that center panel along the bottom. In Agamemnon's hand. You see Iphigenia's apparent agency offering herself as a willing sacrifice so the winds will blow and the Greek ships could sail to Troy. But it's we, the readers, who make meaning of that splash across the moon at the top center panel on the fourth page. We're the ones who supply the sword's heavy blow against innocent neck. It's so abrupt, it's so brutal. And this work in the gutters, when you start to explore this with your students, offers a metacognitive opportunity, a chance for you to think with your students about their thinking, about how readers consume sources, how they eat up these sources, textual and visual, what a reader brings to the experience of a source, and how that process of interacting with the source shapes that source's meaning. Next slide. So apart from making meaning across disparate sources, one of the most significant issues world history students struggle with, especially in early world history, so pre-1500, the stuff that I do, is the large scales of time and how to make sense of them. Now that grappling with periodization plays out in the study of comics as well, especially when you look at comics in the longue durée. Sharing with students examples of what might count as the comics medium, encouraging them to think about how comics change over time, inviting from them a critical stance on the ages of comics. So stone and thread, platinum, gold, silver, bronze, modern, postmodern, all of that thinking with respect to comics can help students recognize the usefulness of periodization in comics and in world historical thinking, but also the limits and pitfalls of that categorizing. Next slide, Pam. So once learners have acquired that vocabulary for talking about comics, that's where I started, have thought about their own role in making meaning on the panels and in the gutters, that's where I was talking about Age of Bronze there, and have done that thinking about time and how and whether to segment that time into periods. The learners in a history and comics class or comics and history class are well equipped to analyze how issues that matter for a long global history change over time in comics. You can track everything from wealth accumulation and gender roles. You can track political structures and warfare, interactions with the environment, family groupings. All of these issues show up in graphic media over time. Now, what I'm showcasing here on this slide are screenshots from a collaborative project that my students completed in week 12 of 16 weeks. Each student contributed one moment in time to a digital timeline. They annotated a comic page from that moment. They explained what it demonstrates about a social issue at that particular moment in time. And once completed, once all of the students created their slide, it gave students a chance to click through and see how world historical concepts change over time in graphic media, which meant that they were prepared to then do their own independent paper, hopefully avoiding the pitfalls Lawrence was describing, their own independent paper exploring how comics deal with a historical topic over time. Okay, so I've covered a lot very quickly, I know, probably not as quickly as I was supposed to, but to sum up, together all of these micro-scaffolded activities enabled students to track, as my title suggested, comics through time in a way that builds exactly the thinking about sources, about time, about issues in sources over time that we want to see in a world history classroom. I hope this whirlwind has given you just some ideas, and thank you very much. And take it away, Marianne.
Thank you, Beth. So for my little part of this presentation, I'm going to talk about a comic series that I've been using this past semester. It was first published in the 1920s and ran through the 1930s. It's called Highlights of History. The class I use them in is chiefly interested in applying the historian's craft to concepts of nationalism through the lens of popular culture. So for this assignment, I want to introduce students first to chronicling America and that as a database, and second to the notion that comics can be used not only to understand history, but to be history themselves. The essence of the assignment is that I tell them to dive into chronicling America, find an episode of the highlights of history, and then deconstruct it. I ask them to gather the basic bibliographic data and then prepare notes on the history as it is presented in the comic, using many of the same questions and points of examination we've already been hearing about in this presentation. Who is discussed or depicted and who isn't? Who is actually named? What tense is used? What role do the images play in helping or hindering the narrative, and why? Ideally, I want them to be able to compare the presentation of the historical moment in the comic to one in a modern textbook or monograph. As a class, we compare our notes on the comics, helping us to see how they sort of standardized or homogenized a narrative of US or world history at the time. I ask them to think too beyond the comic, echoing what Lawrence spoke to in regards to the vacuum. What's the context in which the issue is published, both in a physical sense, where in the newspaper is it, and in a historical sense, how might contemporary politics or scientific understanding be informing the material presented? And then finally, how does this one piece of history as history impact our own understanding of being American or being a member of a global society today? And how is that shaping our sense of national identity, and how was it shaped by a sense of national identity? Finding the source forces them to think about keywords, so echoing the call from our librarian friends, and how the keyword search functions itself. But it also asks them in the process of deconstructing the comic what it means to explore beyond just the written word. So for a few examples, in this issue, the Holy Alliance discusses the European desire to see Spain conquer, quote, or reconquer, quote, her revolted colonies in the New World, unquote. Obviously, this is setting the stage for a later discussion of the Monroe Doctrine, but Uncle Sam in the last panel points to America for Americans sign, which opens up a host of further questions. Not only did TR or Theodore Roosevelt offer an America for Americans speech in 1916, but we also know that that speech was picked up and manipulated by the KKK in the 1920s. This comic, as you see here, was issued in 1925. Embedded in these three words is a question, not answered in the comic, about what it is to be American, who is American, and who isn't. In issues discussing the institution of slavery, we see the narrative of it as being a, quote, necessary evil, unquote, which was common in historical books, in history books of the day, being echoed here in the comic. The visuals, moreover, as you clearly can see, play with minstrel tropes, which were also common at the time, and reinforced assumptions and societal norms of the era, further sort of arguing for a normative nature in reading American history as being presented in this comic. Highlights was not only focused on US history. This portion, there we go. This portion is from a full page issue explaining the life of the Prophet Muhammad. It opens up a variety of discussions, not least of which about the question of iconoclasm. But interesting, it also includes questions, or could raise questions, about the role of women in early Islamic society. Two, we can look at the more prosaic elements about trade and connectivity of cultures, and we can deconstruct the assertion that Arabs had only, quote, slight contact with outside communities. And that's all before we even get into the question of civilized and uncivilized communities. Lastly, we can take this sort of analysis a step further and bring in other comics from the era which offered similar but distinctly different insights on history. This Canada of ours ran through the second half of the 1920s, obviously in Canada. It can be informative to see how comics covering something like the Boston Massacre read very differently in shifting whose national perspective is being used. And with that, we will move to Caleb.
Thank you, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about historical thinking through world history comics. So encouraging students to think about the skills of the historian through these comics. Thank you. You can go to the next slide. So some of you may be familiar with Hayden White's work, Meta History. In this book, Hayden White explains to make a story intelligible, to make it meaningful as history, historians either consciously or unconsciously make it conform to their own personal preferences and ideological preferences. The table that I've inserted on this slide, if you read it left to right, you see those preferences coming under the head of ideology, as I said, an influence that hardly needs to be elaborated, as well as an argument or an explanation, which is the general model that historians use to talk about and have used to talk about historical units, that is to say, individual agents, ideas, trade figures, etc., anything that you can isolate in the historical field, and how they're related to each other and to larger wholes, as well as this question of implotment, of making a story out of the facts. And based on the, White argues, the genre into which that story falls, you get very different forms of history, even with the same base information. And I think that comics can do this too. The example that I've put here on the right-hand side is from a graphic biography, A Chinese Life by Li Gunwu. And through this comic, you could show the passage of time, not just in the sense of a chronology or a sort of dry accounting of facts, but in order for the comic to work, to tell about the life of this person, it has to be put into a logical visual medium that needs to flow from panel to panel, page to page, and in the case of this rather large biography, volume to volume. So what I want to emphasize here is that by using comics in a world history classroom, you can get students to think not only about information that may be new to them and arguments that may be new to them, but thinking about history as a constructed story, not something that is self-evident, but has to be put together. And the way in which that story is put together will drastically alter what kind of history you get. Next slide, please. I'm not only advocating for using his comics in a history classroom, I think there is merit to creating comics in a history classroom. And you can do something like the example assignment that I've put here, which I believe is scalable across the spectrum for our audience's purposes, by getting students to put their own stories into a narrative comic form. It will drive home some of those lessons that you can point out in an already existing graphic history, but it becomes more meaningful when the students have done it themselves. And you can do this through a mini assignment like this, where using something as long as a whole page, a 9-panel page, or as short as a 3-panel story, or even a 1-panel kind of moment in time, getting students to depict, say, a day in their life, something routine for them, or something related to material in your own courses. By trying to tell the story of the French Revolution in 3 panels, students are going to have to think pretty carefully about what information goes in, what goes out, and what are the consequences of that kind of selection and storytelling. Students can then also be asked to justify those choices. Again, driving home how important it is for historians at all levels to think about what sources are available to them, how they incorporate them, and how they try to tell a logical, meaningful story out of this set of data or information. Next slide, please. Another reason I think you should include these comics in your world history classroom is because they demystify the role of objectivity in history, or the idea that history is some sort of omniscient, objective pursuit. You can click for the next picture. So these are a couple of other pages from A Chinese Life. And why I selected this one is because it offers, in the prologue of the first volume, a kind of meta commentary on the creation of this comic. In particular, the last image caught my eye the first time I read this. There we go, thank you. Where a young Lee is spoken to by the narrator of the comic and by his writing partner, Philip Otier, with whom he wrote the comics, asking the young boy if he wants to come into the 21st century because someone's going to tell his story there. So this is sort of an example that I think students would find quite interesting because it makes overt this process of explicit creation in a history that isn't always obvious when we're looking at material from decades or centuries past. All right. Final slide, please. I've done this in an example assignment of my own 3 years ago, teaching a summer course at UC Davis, a survey on modern Europe, in which I asked students to do exactly this, to find a comic, a graphic biography, anything that interested them based on a set number of themes that we had discussed in the course, and to use not only the image or the information, but the images of a comic to show how these books both explored and expounded on particular world historical themes, again, according to the topics that they selected. So just a brief example of what can be done, both using comics as sources, as assignments, and in the act of creation, to get students to think about history not as just information to retain, but a story that is being created and one that's constantly being recreated in ways that require their own critical thinking skills. Thank you very much. So that concludes part 1 of our session this evening. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to send everyone to breakout rooms where each of our panelists has selected a couple of interesting comics pages for us to look at, try to deconstruct using some discussion questions that we've provided for you that are on the next slide. And of course, we are not limited to these questions. They're only here to get the creative juices flowing. We encourage everyone to jump in with their own questions and observations as we go on in our breakout sessions. So unless there's anything else to add, I think we can push the button.
At this point, right, we have about 40 of us still here. And I think we should continue this conversation that we began in the breakout rooms. Now, I was in breakout room 1. So I'm going to go in reverse group order because I feel like I shouldn't be the one, starting in. Who was let's see, we had 6. So who was breakout room 6?
I think that was us.
That was you guys.
Yeah.
All right, Pam. Would you guys like to share some of your insights? And I will share the comic for everybody who didn't get to see it before.
Sure. So I'll jump in, and anyone who is in our group, feel free. We looked at a spread from Kent State for Dead in Ohio. And some of the things we talked about is needing the vocabulary to discuss comics. We talked about how the text varies, the sizing, the bolding, that matters for what's being conveyed. The perspective, you can have perspective discussions from whether the crowds are faceless or detailed. It was noted that there's an R. Crumb-like style in this particular comic. So there's a similar visual language that's going on there, and questioning whether or not that was a deliberate artistic choice because it's a comic about that time period when you might recognize it as. And then we had a great discussion about, is there room for comics in the world history course that is not graphic biography, but then also is not US examples. So people were sharing examples like Shoah, the UNESCO, there's one about women in Africa, boxers and saints. There's lots about the ancient world, the Middle East. So there are comics from all over the world that would cover those. And then there was an assignment to create where the students create their own comic, but a certain percentage of it has to be images that are historical and integrated in with the story that they decide to tell. And then an idea to compare first-person accounts to fictional comics might work, so you can get some of the history in that way. This is the page that we looked at, so you can all see that.
Yeah, we actually just spent a lot of time talking about different ways to apply this within the world history classroom. There are several of us who teach AP World. So we kind of looked at different ways and different sources for that.
Is there anything else your group, or are there any questions that anybody else has from the group at large?
Yeah, I guess I have a question. Just thinking of, when I look at a comic, the first thing I want to do is I want to plop it into a historical time period when it was created, right? And I think of, for some reason, like a textbook to me should be doing the exact same thing, but I feel like they can be a little bit more timeless. But a comic to me, it's not, right? And so if I have a student looking at a comic that is created in a specific time and place, but talking about an event that's earlier, there's like two narratives going on, right? There's the narrative of the past that's overtly being told, but it's also telling about how the people at that time are viewing or constructing the past. And I'm wondering how people are experiencing their students navigating those two layers, because I think it's a fascinating layer and I love talking to my students about it, but I would love to have more tools to talk to my students about these two layers, about when we see historical events being portrayed in what is essentially pop culture.
Anybody want to try and tackle that one?
I'm willing to jump in on that. So the other guys, I'm like, see what I can talk. The reason why I love that question, Deanna, is that it is so much the problem that we run into with early world history, with a source. It's the same problem we have with our written sources, right? You take somebody like Herodotus writing about the 5th century BCE, but when Herodotus is writing about ancient Egypt, he's writing about something 2,000 years before him. And getting students to bust through that sense, oh, well, Herodotus is a primary source because he's old. And then you have to get to it and say, well, actually, every source is a primary source, but for what? And then step back from that and say, okay, what is this also a secondary source for? And how did it get its information? How did it construct its story? And so I think that's a great question that transcends comics, but is about our complex historical sources for doing world history in general. And I love that you pulled it in with comics, because I had never thought of it that way before. That's a great point. Anybody else want to jump in?
Something else comes to mind, like say if you're, you look at an example of Marvel's Black Panther from the mid and late 60s. You will have imagery and storylines that discuss earlier eras of European imperialism and colonization, but they're taking place in an era of decolonization. And it creates this kind of multiple layers of analysis that students have to then carry out, that they're speaking to both of these periods at the same time. Oh, that's excellent, Beth.
Breakout room 5? Who was that?
That was me.
Aha, Alonzo.
Is that the right one, Alonzo?
Oh no, it's number 4.
Oh, wait, where did we go?
See, it's not just me.
Okay, there we go. Sorry.
Are you guys gonna put together like a teaching anthology? I feel like you have so much cool stuff here. It would be so cool.
The idea has been mentioned, but there is a lot of other work in the way.
So this is a page from the art of Charlie Chan Hock Chi, and a creator named Sunny Liu. And he uses a completely fictionalized cartoonist or comic creator named Charlie Chan Hock Chi to tell a history of Singapore itself. And I chose this page and wanted to center a lot of the discussion on I had been talking about earlier, which is the the need to both as an educator and then also as a student decode not just the written word, but also the visuals itself, right? And here, this is all his work, but he's approximating, some different approaches to cartooning in order to tell different areas of the story. So we talked about that. We talked about usage, right? How you might use art of Charlie Chan, what sections might work best in what classes, and when to kind of go micro in terms of comic work, right? When to focus on 1 or 2 pages, and then also when to take the entire work as a whole and integrate that into curriculum and the classroom.
Excellent. Is there anybody that wants to add to this, or?
I just had a couple of thoughts about it that didn't quite formulate before the end of the breakout room, but I really like the what you were telling us, Alonso, about how the style that he uses evolves in keeping with the style, the comic book styles of the time. And I mean, that would be a huge problem for me because I would just geek out like crazy about that, and it would not be what I was probably meant to be teaching at the time, because I'd probably be focusing more on the content. But I'd be like, guys, this is amazing. Look at this faded paper and the Scotch tape marks and stuff. And just talking about the aesthetics of it, and then that it's an art history piece. But I was thinking, based on Jonathan's question in the room, about how on earth would you teach a 300-page graphic novel in a world history class? And I mean, I'm lucky in that I am not restricted by content at my institution. I already skim over just an absolute ton of stuff, even more than we do in the World History Survey anyway, and then do deep dives. And I think this would be a really good opportunity to look at 20th century, particularly outside of the West. Decolonization came up, but a kind of a larger arc of what happens in a small place that really doesn't have much power, and how does this play out? And you have the students do the kind of the big scaffolding of the big story, but then you look at this and maybe have them write a paper or do some other thing that connects it, to those bigger themes, and say, how does this particular story of one person in one really tiny place, like one of the smallest nations in the entire world, how does it give a more kind of down-to-earth feeling of rise of authoritarianism and the Cold War and massive economic globalization and all these themes that we study through the 20th century. But it's still a huge sacrifice of 300 pages.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. Who was group 4?
So that was our room, and for the sake of time, I'll keep this real short. So I used 3 pages from a pretty sprawling graphic biography, A Chinese Life by Li Kunwu, and a couple of the themes that came up, and I appreciate some of the other contributions that I think might help answer the problems we were wrestling with in our room, over questions like, how do you introduce students not just to the comic itself and all of the challenges that presents, but also to the historical context around the events that you want students to start thinking about. How might you use the same comic and using several different themes or approaches, try to get different information, different insights out of students? So in our example, one takeaway might be the use of language between the Chinese characters, the translations, and trying to understand the intricacies of tonal language, which is the comedy or the tension in these pages. Another approach might be to look at the role of propaganda and introducing students to Mao, the cult of personality, and the Cultural Revolution. There are many avenues that will intersect through, say this comic example, but they all require different forms of context to get students thinking about the comic the way you want them to. And as well as issues of comics outside of the US and thinking about not just American or Western style comics, but manga and the various national comics, and trying to build a broader, more complete picture of what exactly are comics.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And then group 3.
That's me.
Okay.
So our group was looking at a actually very, very recent sort of modern primary source comic, one I use with my students, which is the first issue of Union Jack London Falling, which was in 2006 to 2007, and was a commentary on the 7/7 bombings from the preceding year. The comic itself, the pages I was showing our breakout room, is a confrontation between two nominally coalition allies, Sabra, who represents Israel, and Arabian Night, who represents the Saudis, in their hunt for a terrorist organization in the heart of London. As you can see, it's not the most friendly relationship. So our room talked a little bit about the complexities of representing something as really problematic as the Israeli-Muslim relationship in the Middle East, as well as representation of actually who are good guys that you can put in a comic, and the fact that so frequently in the Middle East it's Israel, or sometimes maybe the Saudis, but it's very hard to find positive protagonist representation in particularly in comics, since they are Western-centric and particularly American-centric bias view of the world. We spent the rest of the time largely talking about constraints of how to teach comics when you're unfamiliar with the vocabulary or the methodology, and how to deal with teaching them in a 10-week or less term for those of us who are not fortunate enough to have luxurious 16-week semesters. Do any of our folks from our room want to jump in? I think I covered most of it.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, Lawrence. So Beth, I think that means you're up for your curveball, I'm going to call it.
Yes, it is a curveball. And my poor group members felt it. I chose this image because I wanted the participants to think about how do you process something that doesn't easily look like a comic? How do you use the same vocabulary to try to analyze something that's clearly a visual document? I think the biggest takeaway from our group was the fact that just because it's an image doesn't make it easy. I think that very often folk come to comics thinking, oh, I have English language learners or low literacy. That means that if I show these images, students will have an easier time consuming the historical content. And by putting this in front of 6 very smart group members, they realized just how hard it is to analyze images without context, how to talk about images without the vocabulary for doing so. And so we worked through this and it was kind of fun. When we first started looking at it, there was a lot of silence. Then we backed out, talked about Black Panther and Mary Tyler Moore for a little bit, and then came back around to it. And our participants started to see some pretty interesting things, like how buildings were serving as a frame for the panel, how differences in clothing and standing versus kneeling can give us a sense of victory and conquest, how background is working and foreground and midground in the image as it's displayed, and also how the image itself is contained within a larger strip circling up this 100-foot column. So participants got some really neat things out of it once we got over the initial gulp, and they came up with some fantastic historical parallels for thinking about graphic depictions of conquest, graphic depictions of victory over time, and so I think it came out to be a good conversation in the end. I was really happy with the group for getting past that initial. Group members, anything to add?
I'm impressed with your group. Well done, you guys.
They were good.
So
That's amazing, as always.
And that means that the last one is the one that we did. And here I can't be on a panel with Beth and ever think I'm going to have the oldest comic. This is a paltry 1934 comic that ran in the Washington, D.C. Evening Star. It was a series. Yeah, it was a current event, exactly. A series that ran through the 1920s and 30s. Like I said earlier, this is part of that Highlights of History. And my group did a fabulous job of deconstructing it and really thinking about it in terms of the context around when this would have been published. And yet also kind of acknowledging that it was sort of interesting to see the Sepoy Rebellion even mentioned in a series of historical comics from the 1930s being published in the United States. This was actually a syndicated comic. It ran in the United States and in Canada as well. There were definitely some important takeaways though, and interestingly, even though it's text heavy, there were a lot of interesting takeaways from the visuals about placement of characters, about the clear sort of juxtaposition, even though it's in black and white, the clear juxtaposition between, sort of the Indian characters and the white British characters, and who is supposed to be the quote unquote good guy and who's supposed to be the bad guy in this narrative. Lots of important takeaways that could resonate with Americans, even if it was sort of foreign history. So really good discussion, I think, there. Was there anything that the group wanted to add to that? We are getting a ton of comments going on in chat, so I'm not going to try and roll through this all right now, but it looks like everybody's getting responses, so that's good. Do look forward to your goodie bag. A digital goodie bag will be arriving soon. It should be sent out tomorrow, I believe is the plan, to have it sent out to everyone who registered. It will include this slide deck that we've been through, all the group work that we did on our slides, the business cards, which you already have the link to, some syllabi and assignments that the rest of us have compiled and have used or worked with, and as well as a working reading list that we encourage you all to add to and participate with. It is sort of a starting point, a list of works that we're familiar with, but please add to it. We want this to be a database that everyone can look through and play with and pull from in the coming weeks, months, years, semesters, how the world is broken up. Thank you all so much for joining us. This has been so much fun. Thank you to my panelists, my presenters for doing this with me. I'm really, really sorry that we're out of time. I would love to continue this conversation. But please do look for future events. We will try and do more of this later. Carrie, anything that we need to wrap up with?
No, I think that this is very good.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carrie.
This is brilliant. Thank you all.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Folks, good night. Take care.
Along with